talked about simple interest. If you are investing some money, you can earn simple interest, or if you're taking out a loan or taking out some form of credit, you can pay simple interest. That's one type of interest that we use. The second one is called compound interest. And the best way to explain compound interest is to do an example. And then I'll go back to this explanation here. So this example one would be a question from lesson 1.1 on simple interest. So this guy invests $5,000 in a financial institution at 6% interest per year, and we're asked to calculate his interest at the end of 3 years. Remember, we're using the simple interest formula. Interest is equal to the principal times the rate as a decimal times the time in years. So in this question, the interest I don't know. The principal is $5,000. The rate of interest is 6%, but I have to change that to a decimal by moving it back, moving the decimal point back 2 spaces to get 0.06. And the time is in years is 3. So in this example, we would take 5,000 times 0.06 times 3. And then once we calculate that, I've got it here, we would get $900. Or basically, he would earn $300 a year. But you could calculate the interest at the first year as 300, then 300, then 300. He makes the same amount of interest every year. But the second example is a little bit different. Here, same guy, same money to invest, same interest rate, but now it says compounded annually. What that means is that interest is calculated every year and then added to how much he invested. And then that the next year interest is calculated on what he invested and the interest he earned in the previous year. So the best way to show this is a chart. So at the end of year, then his interest will calculate, and then the amount. So at the end of year one, we calculate his interest by doing $5,000, how much he invested, times the interest rate as a decimal, times 1 year. And we get $300. So he earns $300 at the end of the first year. If it was simple interest, he'd earn $300 at the end of the second year. And then he'd earn $300 at the end of the third year. But this is a little different. So his new amount is how much he invested plus the interest he got for this year. That means he now has $5,300. So at the end of the second year, we're not going to calculate interest on the 5,000. He actually has 5,300 now. So we're going to calculate interest on the 5,300. times the interest rate times 1 year. And that will give us $318. Which means the amount of his investment and interest at the end of 2 years is $5,618. If it was simple interest, it would have only been $5,600. So he's getting more interest because we're calculating interest on interest he's previously earned. At the end of year 3, which is how long this investment lasts, remember, he now has this much, 5618. That's what's going to be calculated, or that's what we're going to calculate the interest on. And we get $337.08, which means how much money he has now is $5,618 plus $337.08, $5,955.08. So how much interest did he earn with this method? Well, remember, so we take how much he's got now. He's got 59.5508. We take away the amount he originally invested, 5,000. That means he made $955.08. Whereas with simple interest above, he only made $900. So with simple interest, we calculated his interest once at the end of the 3 years. With compound interest, we calculated his interest 3 separate times. And he actually ended up getting more money in interest because of that. That's the difference between the two, okay? Is compound interest, you calculate interest on interest he's previously earned. And that's what I mean when I say up here. Okay? You are earning interest on interest. So if you're investing money, compound interest is better than simple interest because you'll make more money. However, if you're borrowing money, compound interest is not as good as simple interest because you'll be paying more money. Now, this is a pretty long way to figure out to use compound interest. We have a formula we can use. And this is a formula that I would suggest you put on your resource sheet. I strongly suggest you put on your resource sheet. It's a little bit more complicated than the simple interest formula. And it's this. So it looks a little complicated, but once you use it a couple of times, you'll get the hang of it. You just got to remember to do things in the correct order. So what do all these letters mean? Well, what we're calculating when we use this formula is the final amount of an investment or loan. How much you invested or borrowed, the principal, plus the interest that you earned. P is the same as in the simple interest formula, the principal. How much you started with, how much you borrowed initially, or how much you invested. R is still the same. R is still the same. It's the rate of interest as a decimal. N is new. That is the number of interest periods in a year. And we'll see below what those mean. And finally, T is the length of time in years. So you got to read the question carefully to make sure you understand what values you put in for P, R, N, and T. P, R, and T we've already used, but N is a little bit tricky because sometimes it depends on the question. But if you get, let's say you invest something and its interest is compounded annually, that means interest is calculated once a year. Once a year. Therefore, the value of N would be 1 because it's calculated one time. Semi-annually, interest is calculated twice a year. So that means if you invest something, 6 months later, we calculate interest, and then another 6 months, we calculate interest again. So if you're investing money, you're making more. If you're borrowing money, you're paying more. The value of N is 2. Quarterly, 4 times a year. So N is 4. Bi-weekly, every 2 weeks. What would N be there? Yeah, so that would be this one. Correct. So every week would be 52 times. Every 2 weeks would be half that, 26 times. And then finally, daily, 365 times a year. Which would be great if you were investing, and not so great if you were borrowing. Some credit companies do it. Like we'll talk about this later, but they'll give you like if you borrow money and say some sort of credit card, they'll give you a grace period. So they'll say, okay, you've got 21 days or 30 days to pay the amount. something like that. If you pay it by then, you don't get charged any interest and you're fine. But if you don't, then they start charging you interest from the date that you bought it until you pay it off. So sometimes it's simple interest, sometimes it's compound interest. This is exactly why people get into credit card debt. Because if they don't pay it off, it starts to add up quickly. And then they have to pay more off, and they can't afford to pay more off, and they can't make minimum payments. They keep getting charged more interest, and before you know it, it's out of control. That's why you got to be really careful with credit, especially credit cards. Because, I mean, Visa and MasterCard, the interest rate they'll charge you is probably around 18, 19%, which is pretty high. Well, it could be compounded daily, or it could be simple interest, but that's a high interest rate. Some department stores, like the Bay, used to go like 28%. It was insane. So credit cards can be very nasty. Okay, so let's practice using this formula with the same example we started with. We'll do 2 more examples. So same guys, same amount investing, 6% compounded annually, calculate his interest. So we need to figure out how much is the amount of his investment if he invests a principal of $5,000. Interest rate is 6%, which as a decimal is 0.06. N is 1 because it's compounded annually. So N is 1. And T, he's invested it for 3 years. So using the formula, A equals P times 1 plus R divide N raised to the N times T. Let's plug our numbers in. 5,000 times 1 plus 0.06 divide 1 raised to the 1 times 3. Okay, so this is where you got to be careful with the order that you do things. We're going to do inside the parentheses first. So 0.06 divide 1 is 0.06 plus 1 is 1.06. So we're going to do this first, and we're going to do this at the same time, because an easier way to say 1 times 3 is just 3. And we always do exponents before multiplication. So the next thing I'm going to do is 1.06 to the third. That's something that you're going to need a calculator for. When you do that, you're going to get 5,000 times 1.06 to the third is 1.191016. So the last thing to do is multiply those two together, and you get $5,955.08, which is what we got when we used that table. So you see the formula is much quicker. So remember the question we were asked to find the interest. So we got to do one more step. We got to do 59,5508 minus 5,000. That means his interest is, like we calculated before, $955.08. Okay, let's do this last example where we practice using the formula. Same question, almost. Same principle. I'll just put P. Do this instead. P. This is R. Remember, it's 0.06 is a decimal. Compounded quarterly. So how many interest periods? 4. That's the difference. T is still 3. So now what we're going to do, 5,000 times 1 plus 0.06 divide 4 raised to the 4 times 3. So our first steps are going to be calculating here and put these two to multiply those two together. So for this on your calculator, you do 0.06 divide 4 and then add 1. And when you do that, you'll get 1.015. And 4 times 3 is 12. Do the exponent first. So when you do 1.015 raised to the 12th, you're going to get, I'm just going to write out what was displayed on my calculator. And then when you multiply those two together, and remember, whenever you answer in money, you always round to 2 decimal places. $5,978.09. Whoops, that's not the end of the question. So how much did he earn this way? Well, the interest is the two together, $5,978.09, minus how much he invested. $978.09 is how much he made in interest, which makes sense because interest was calculated more often. If you look at the 2 examples we just did, if interest is only calculated once, as opposed to 4 times, he's going to get more when it's calculated 4 times. How much more? Well, it depends on how much he invests. It depends on how much the interest rate is. Okay, I mean, interest rates are, 6% for investing is, well, I guess it's about right. It seems a little high. What did I do? I went to Cambrian Credit Union a couple of weeks ago, and I saw their interest rates. So I took a photo of it because I'm a math nerd. And where is it? Yeah, the savings account. If you invest something for 1 year, you get 4%. If you invest it for 2 years, you get 4.2%. And if you go all the way up to 5 years, you get 5%. So often banks and financial institutions will do that. They'll give you a higher interest rate if you invest your money longer. Okay.